Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Melissa Deckman. I'm the CEO of Public Religion Research Institute. I'm here today in this webinar to talk about our new study, which looks at abortion views in all 50 states. Here we detail findings from PRRI's 2023 American Values Atlas. I'm joined today by three fantastic reporters who are covering reproductive rights as part of their beats, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves in just a few minutes. But I wanted to give you guys a lay of the land of the order of our webinar. So I'm going to be presenting some findings from our survey in three parts. In the first section, I'm going to talk a bit about the overall landscape of abortion policy when it comes to reproductive rights. And then we're going to look at Americans' attitudes within those 50 states. We're going to take a bit of a breather, and we're going to hear from our panelists for some of their thoughts about our findings, and we'll have a conversation about that first section. Then we're going to turn to the second part of our webinar, which is really looking at Americans' attitudes about the importance of abortion with respect to their election choices here, essentially the role of abortion as a litmus test issue. And then we're also going to take a look at some new data with respect to Americans' attitudes on accessing the abortion pill. We'll stop again, get some feedback and thoughts from our panelists and have a good conversation there. And then finally, we're going to focus specifically on the role of religion and Christian nationalism in helping us understand American views about abortion. So I'm going to, before I begin diving into some of the data here, I'd actually like our panelists to introduce themselves in alphabetical order. So we're going to start with Elisha Brown.
Thanks, Melissa, for that introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm Elisha Brown. I'm a Reproductive Rights Today newsletter author at States Newsroom. I cover reproductive rights, so that includes abortion policy in all the states, maternal health, contraception. I really run the gamut of reproductive rights and health. A recent story I covered this week in the newsletter was I looked at what states have abortion shield laws that protect patients and providers from out-of-state investigations or extraditions.
Great. Grace.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and thank you to Melissa for that introduction. My name is Grace Panetta. I'm a political reporter at the 19th, a nonprofit newsroom covering the intersection of gender, politics, and policy, and my beat focuses a lot on abortion on the ballot, directly and indirectly. So as you all can imagine, this month, my colleagues and I have been writing a lot about the recent developments in Arizona and Florida as they relate to abortion access and what that means at the ballot box.
Hi, I'm Kate Zernike. I'm a reporter for the New York Times. I'm a reporter on the national desk, and since January 2022, I've been covering abortion almost exclusively. I've been focused mostly on the politics of abortion because my background is so much in political reporting. So I've been looking a lot lately about the ballot measures in different states. But one of the more significant stories I've done in recent months is a story about Wyoming and an effort to open an abortion clinic there, and how even though Wyoming is such a conservative state, there has actually been support for abortion rights there. And I use that story to talk about how even in red states, we're seeing a real strong libertarian tradition that says people don't want government involved in abortion decisions.
Great. I'm really looking forward to your thoughts on some of our survey findings. So let's get started and take a look at some of the data. So to begin, I wanted to talk a little bit about our survey's methodology. So this is a poll that we designed, and we conducted this online from March of last year through December. And so one of the great things about our American Values Atlas is that we have a representative sample of more than 20,000 American adults. So we're able to really provide great granular level data of America's attitudes within all 50 states. The margin of error for our sample with such a large sample size is less than 1%, plus or minus 0.82%. So we're really pleased to be presenting this very high quality data that comes from a random probability sample through Ipsos Knowledge Poll. We'd also like to acknowledge the generous support of Michelle Mercer and Bruce Golden for helping to fund our survey results. All right, so one of the things I'd like to present here is looking at support for abortion legality over time. Since 2010, PRRI has been looking at American attitudes on the legality of abortion. So we simply ask Americans routinely, do you think abortion should be legal in most or all cases? Or alternatively, do you think that abortion should be illegal in most or all cases? So this chart is looking at American support for abortion legality over time. And I think there's a couple things that are of note here. One is if you look at the gray line, we're looking at all Americans here. support for abortion legality has gone up among the general public from 55% in 2010 when we first started asking this question to 64% today. So roughly 2/3 of Americans think that abortion should be legal in most or all cases. However, one of the other things you'll note, though, is that among Republicans, there's a few little variances in a couple of years, but generally speaking, Republicans' attitudes about abortion legality have essentially stayed the same. But we see more support among Democrats for abortion legality in most or all cases, and also a notable increase among independents as well. Next, I wanted to take a look at abortion policy at the state level and attitudes about abortion policy. As I think already our reporters have indicated, there's lots of activity happening with respect to abortion policy in wake of the Dobbs decision. And here I just wanted to give our viewers a lay of the land currently. So we looked at abortion policy in states by essentially their classification status as being the most restrictive. Essentially, the red states denote where state policy has virtually banned abortion in most or all cases, with very few exceptions. The blue states are the least restrictive, where I think the right to access legal abortion really has no gestational limits. The green states tend to be, I think, more protective of reproductive rights more broadly. But this gives you a sense of what has happened in wake of Roe being overturned, is we have a landscape in which policies are vary dramatically from state to state. Although, if you notice here, the red states and also the more restrictive states, the orange or golden states here, also tend to be, if you look at an electoral college map, if you keep thinking that in the back of your mind, there definitely, I think, are some overlays here. So I wanted to turn to some of that data with respect to states. And here we're plotting on our graph Americans' attitudes about abortion legality in all 50 states. And I think what's really notable is that in no state do we have, or really in very few states, we don't have a situation where a majority of Americans disapprove of or think that abortion should be illegal in most cases. By contrast, we find that support for abortion legality is high in most states. Only in 5 states, and those are the states that are the very light green, do we have a situation where fewer than half of state residents think that abortion should be legal in all or most cases. In fact, we find in states with very restrictive policies, the state of Florida, for example, which of course just this week has begun enactment of its 6-week ban on abortion. 62% of residents in the state of Florida think abortion should be illegal in all or most cases, but that clearly is not the policy that's in place. Another way to look at this is to look at the reverse position. So here we're looking at the percentage of Americans who say that abortion should be illegal in all cases, essentially a support for an abortion ban. And what's really telling in this data, in every state, most state residents oppose this sort of policy. I guess the floor would be, I guess a 16% is, or I guess the ceiling of that would be 16%. So in about a handful of states, you have no more than 16% of state residents saying that abortion should be illegal in all cases. So those policies that are essentially banning the procedure are highly unpopular, no matter the state that folks live in. And getting back to that earlier map that we had with respect to looking at states where the abortion policy it's been completely banned to the least restrictive, I want to draw your attention to this final graph and looking at all Americans. So even Americans who reside in states where the procedure has been essentially banned, a majority of those residents think that abortion should be legal in all or most cases. Now, in the least restrictive states, we see higher supports for abortion legality. These are typically blue states, often dominated by state legislatures who are that are Democratic. But in no state are we finding that, even in states that have banned the procedure, that most citizens in those states support those sorts of policies. The other thing to note in this table, too, for me, I think is particularly telling and helping us to explain the political situation we're in now, is looking among Republicans. Now, of course, Republicans have never been broadly supportive of abortion rights. I mean, we know the parties have distinct policy decisions that they've staked out. But in states where the policy has been to completely or essentially ban abortion, Republicans, only 27% of Republicans in those states support legal access to abortion. And I think it kind of sets into motion an understanding of why we see ourselves in this policy landscape currently. The Republicans who are in charge of those legislatures tend to be the least supportive of abortion rights, per se. Right, so I want to stop here and actually take some questions from our panelists. So Kate, is there anything about the data we presented so far that you find interesting or you wanted to comment on?
Yeah, so one thing, obviously, I think the most significant thing that we've seen in polls is this shift, like this real sort of waking up among Democratic voters who support abortion rights. You know, for years, reproductive rights groups have been saying that, like, you know, they go to Democratic voters and to Republican women who support abortion rights and say, you know, what would it take for you to stand out and come out and defend, to defend Roe v. Wade? Because, you know, for a long time, people sort of took it for granted. And these voters would say, oh, well, if, you know, if it were ever overturned, I would take to the streets. And that's really what we've seen, is that this has just completely motivated Democratic voters. But the other thing that I notice, and I think that this is what's happening among Republican voters and why we see these majorities in all, as you say, all but 5 states supporting the legality of abortion in all or most cases, is that people really are, when you have conversations with them, they're really starting to understand the idea that abortion is healthcare. And I think for a long time, people thought that was just a slogan. They didn't know what it meant. But they are increasingly hearing stories about women who have been denied abortions or who had to travel across state lines to get abortions. And I think those stories are really moving the needle for people. And when people think about this as healthcare, rather than like, well, a woman should have a right to choose, they think, well, I don't really think the government should be involved in making healthcare decisions. And I think that is, as I mentioned in my intro, you know, it's this libertarian tradition among Americans. They really don't, they want small government. They want to be free to make their own decisions.
Okay, thanks. Grace or Elisha, did you want to chime in on some of the data that we've presented so far? Some of your thoughts about what we're finding?
There were some results at the state level I think were really fascinating, especially thinking about where abortion could be on the ballot this year. It did stick out to me that in the 5 states where support for legal abortion was below 50%, 2 of them, South Dakota and Arkansas, could have measures on the ballot enshrining a right to abortion to a certain point on the ballot this year. And I think that's going to be a really interesting test because so far we've seen abortion ballot measures have an undefeated streak since the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And what does that look like in a state where support for abortion being legal in most or all cases below 50%? On that note, another one that really jumped out at me is Nevada, a critical battleground state. We see support for abortion being among the highest, right up there with Vermont, New York, Massachusetts. And I thought that was a really interesting finding, especially compared to some of the other neighboring Western, Southwestern states.
Elisha, what about you? You're really kind of, I think, looking at the state level opinions and politics happening, being at the States Newsroom. So anything that stood out to you in the survey's findings?
Yeah, there's also a statistic that 64 Americans in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin believe abortion should be legal in all or most cases. And that's really compelling because, you know, in some of those states, such as North Carolina, which is where I am, the Republican-controlled legislator enacted a 12-week ban last year, right? You know, obviously Michigan has abortion rights now because of the amendment in 2022 that was super successful, where the majority of Michiganders, you know, voted to enshrine reproductive rights into the Constitution. But even a state like Georgia, where you have a 6-week ban that was enacted as a trigger law, right? You have 63% of Georgians believe abortion should be legal, yet, you know, in some of these states, it's impossible to do a citizen-led ballot initiative. So, you know, you definitely wonder what that will look like in the upcoming election, even though we're not getting into that. And then Arizona is especially interesting because what you're dealing with in that state is a conservative-leaning Supreme Court that really had a kind of non-constitutionalist interpretation of the 1864 ban, right? And you're seeing even some Republicans this week, as Grace mentioned, voting, in favor of repealing that law. So yeah, there's definitely a disconnect between Republican-controlled legislators and what the majority of Americans in each state believe about abortion.
Yeah, I think if I
So
could
in
just comment, I think,
Yeah, please.
Elisha brings up a really good point, and the question is, one of the questions I think in state elections this fall is whether there will be any consequences, right? So like in Tennessee, there are lawmakers who helped pass the ban on abortion there, who now are trying to get some exceptions in, but they're saying that their Republican colleagues are like, we don't need to do this. They're still very much under the sway of the anti-abortion lobby. Another question is South Carolina, right, where you had these 3 Republican senators, all women, stand up and say, we don't want to support this ban. We don't think there should be a ban. They were not saying, no restrictions on abortion. They were just saying, like, do we really want to ban it entirely? Those women are all facing primary challenges. So it's going to be interesting to see, again, whether there are consequences for Republican legislators one way or the other who have spoken up in favor of in favor of abortion rights, or for those Republicans who are opposed to abortion rights. Like, will we see any Republican voters come out and say, no, I don't want you. I don't like the policy at the state level. I think that's actually, it looks like, based on experience, that's somewhat unlikely that we will see a consequence in that direction.
Do you think, though, that in kind of looking at the policy landscape at the state level, I mean, we clearly have a situation where these policies are undemocratic. They're very much out of the norm of what even state residents want. So is there any sense among Republicans, I mean, you indicated that in South Carolina, it could even be the reverse, right? That any moderation that a state legislator shows in the GOP might be primaried out. But is there any sense in your reporting from any 3 of you that Republicans are kind of having a little bit of a, they're rethinking sort of the policy calculus here, or are they being swayed at all by, I mean, you think about stories in Idaho with the Supreme Court of women being airlifted, right, out emergency airlifts to have access emergency abortion health care. Any sense that there's a change in policy perspective or a movement to moderate even in those states? I'm just curious what you're finding.
I would say not particularly. I think when we saw a sea change was last month, or well, now that would be March, when it came to the kind of seismic Alabama Supreme Court ruling, that's when we saw the kind of greater implications of not only abortion. I know we don't talk about this in this poll, but fetal personhood laws, right? Contraception, IVF. Then you saw obviously the Alabama legislature, which is majority Republican, really work quickly to pass a protective measure. And then you saw this kind of echo, right, in other states, such as Ohio, which has a Republican-controlled legislature, despite the success of Amendment 1 in November. And then Kentucky, which is, has a near total ban and also has no exceptions for rape or incest. So you saw movements to pass IVF measures. And I know in Kentucky, from my colleagues at Kentucky Lantern, it just was too late in the legislative session to really get that through. But then in certain states that don't have exceptions, say for rape or incest, in Kentucky, there were Democrats who tried to push that legislation. In Louisiana, my colleagues at the Illuminator said that as well. These failed. It did not move. I don't know that these numbers or even these stories of health exceptions, right? Obviously the Kate Cox story in Texas. I don't know that it's really moving the pulse or not pulse, but moving the action to Republicans to kind of add exceptions or say, hey, should we widen this ban a little bit, at least when it comes to abortion? And then of course that could change depending on how the general election plays out.
I feel like, I'm curious, Grace, what you think. I feel like I am seeing some push to get some exceptions. Like there seems to be more interest in like protecting women who want to become mothers. But you're right, Elisha, like those states are fairly few. Grace, what do you think? Do you think are you seeing movement to add exceptions among Republican legislators?
I think it kind of depends across states. And I mean, the other thing to note too is that we kind of know, as you both know, from a lot of research shows that especially when it comes to things like rape and incest, exceptions don't really work in practice. For example, in Florida, they now have a 6-week ban. You can get an abortion up to 15 weeks if you jump through all these hoops of filing a police report and going and getting all this documentation that you were indeed assaulted. And I this isn't something we've seen a lot of legislators acknowledge, but I think they kind of are acknowledging it in a way. I think the lack of movement on exceptions is kind of proof that they don't really work in a practical sense, even if they may provide a little bit of political cover. But on the medical side, I think what we saw in Arizona this week, which is really interesting, is to your earlier point, Kate, a lot of lawmakers in that debate over repealing the 1864 ban were saying, hey, I, wanted to be a parent and had a non-viable pregnancy and needed this procedure that under this bill would be banned. In a lot of states where lawmakers claimed, oh yeah, we have exceptions. We see situations where the law is written so vaguely or in an unclear manner that doesn't provide doctors with enough clarity. But still based on what we're kind of seeing in Texas after the Kate Cox case and that lawsuit, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of movement. And really the move I've seen at the state level is lawmakers in places like Texas kind of blaming doctors and saying, oh, it's the doctor's fault. Kind of attacking medical professionals, which is a broader thing within the GOP. So I think there may be some exceptions, but overall, I don't know if that movement's going to change.
I talked to a woman in Wisconsin last week who had had a horrible an abortion for a medical, horrible diagnosis. And she said she's actually a Republican herself, and she wrote to Republican legislators and Democratic legislators and said, like, this is why we can't have abortion bans. And she said the only people she heard back from were Democrats. So I think Republicans want to ignore the whole thing because they know that it's not a winning issue for them.
Well, let's talk a little bit about maybe the politics in terms of the elections that are coming up, both the presidential election, but also looking at some statewide down ballot races as well. So we've been asking Americans about the role of abortion as what we call a political litmus test. And so in 2018, we asked Americans for the first time whether they would only vote for a candidate who shares their views on abortion. And so back in 2018, of course, pre-Dobbs, we found that among Americans who expressed support for abortion legality, so this is the first graph here, 18% said that it was an important decision in terms of who they decided to back as candidates. That has increased to 38% in a post-Dobbs or post-Roe kind of landscape here to 38%. But really among Democrats who are supporters of abortion rights, we've seen it double as a very salient issue. What's interesting though is that even though in 2018, abortion was a more salient political issue for those Americans who oppose abortion, right? And in fact, decades of research I've done on abortion attitudes has shown that for Republicans especially, those are the folks who tended to be single issue voters. We found though that even those who oppose abortion, 36%, there's an increase from 2018 saying that it's still the most important reason they're going to be voting for who they vote for. And even among Republicans, we've seen a notable increase here, which to me signifies sort of the recalcitrant nature of this political issue. It's become even more salient for many Republicans, especially those who oppose it, which I would love to hear some of your thoughts on that in just a minute. And then I also wanted to look at really quickly to present this data as well. A new polling data on Americans' attitudes on access to abortion pills. So we asked Americans in the last year in all 50 states, do you oppose laws that make it illegal to use or receive through the mail FDA-approved drugs for medical abortion? And we found that 68% of Americans oppose this sort of restriction, which is very similar to the roughly 64% who say that abortion should be legal in all of those cases. Notably here, though, we find that there's a majority of Republicans in this case who support that. And even across religious groups, we find more support for this policy. But I want to return to the other slide here and talking about the role of abortion this election. So let's start this time with Elisha. What are you finding in your reporting in terms of the motivation of abortion as a political issue, either at the state election level, in terms of ballot initiatives, or with respect to the presidential election? So maybe share some of your thoughts.
Yeah, of course. I think it's a fact to say that abortion is going to be a major factor in the election. We have, when I did a count in January, there were 11 states where abortion could be on the ballot this year. Right now, in terms of where that's confirmed, of course, you have New York and Maryland. Those were legislatively referred amendments, right? But then in terms of these citizen initiatives, as I believe Kate and Grace already mentioned, of course, you have Florida. Arizona recently, I believe they turned in their ballot numbers. I could be wrong, but I know for sure they've collected more than 500,000 signatures for a petition to restore abortion access up to fetal viability. So I think it's going to be a major role. It's pretty clear from a federal level that the Biden-Harris reelection team is gunning on abortion so much. I mean, you have Vice President Harris, going across the country doing this kind of like fight for reproductive freedom tour. I think something that's really interesting since the fall of Rose, you have President Biden actually, saying the word abortion. I think to some advocates, he maybe isn't talking about it as much as perhaps they would like, and that's kind of deferred to the vice president. But you definitely, I think, at least with the president, you've seen his views on abortion obviously evolve over his decades in American politics. Yeah, and then you're seeing it obviously play a role on the Republican end with that 5-minute video from former President Trump, where he said abortion should be left to the states. And then, of course, he had this kind of blockbuster Time magazine article where he alluded to some kind of abortion pills announcement. Yeah, so you have this issue really pushing Republicans also to actually speak on abortion. But yeah, I'll defer to Kate and Grace for some more context.
Yeah, I think, one thing important to kind of take a step back and note is that since the Dobbs decision, there have really only been elections and ballot measures either in the midterms or in off years, which, as we know, it's higher engaged voters who turn out in those elections. So 2024 is likely to see a somewhat of a different electorate. And it kind of, raises the question, will abortion be as salient in a presidential election with lower turnout, lower engaged voters coming out to vote? Some people might argue it'll be less salient. However, when I'm thinking about looking at that map of the United States, the access landscape since 2022 overall has just gotten so much worse in parts of the country, the entire Southeast. Yeah, if you're, just looking at that Southeast of the United States, if you're in a, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, depending, you may have to travel as far as Virginia, Maryland, the DC area where I am, or even, Illinois, the Midwest, to have any chance of accessing care. And what is that going to look like at the ballot box, knowing how unpopular these types of bans are? And the other thing too, I'll just mention that I think could be an interesting factor is in the states that have ballot measures, there's not really evidence that we've seen yet that abortion rights ballot measures boost Democratic candidates. Voters, behave differently when they're voting up and down on an issue versus voting for a party or a candidate. That could change this year. Nothing in politics is set, but I actually had a conversation for a recent story where, someone in Missouri where there's likely to be an abortion ballot measure, she said, actually, it may help Republicans because voters who disagree with our stance on abortion can kind of separate out that issue and vote on a ballot measure, on the issue on which they mostly disagree with the GOP on, and then still vote, for candidates for whom they agree with on most other things. So those are some dynamics I think about most when it comes to 2024.
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation that this will allow the opportunity for some Republican voters. Well, I can express my viewpoint here on this, but I'll still go ahead and cast my ballot for so-and-so because I'm a Republican and the Democrats are worse on many other things, right? That's kind of the political calculus here. Kate, what are some of your thoughts as we're heading into the election? I mean, my sense is that Democrats are looking at this as the main issue that will help to propel Biden potentially back into the White House. So is that delusional? Is that going to happen? Is there any sort of sense that this really could be as impactful as many Democratic, I think, operatives are hoping?
Well, I don't know what I'd say delusional, but I do wonder sometimes if Democrats are putting not too much weight on abortion, but putting too much hope in abortion. I think the real question mark there is in Arizona, right, which is a swing state and is going to have this ballot measure. Frankly, when the Arizona Supreme Court upheld that 1864 ban, it was as if they had handed the election to Biden, frankly, in that state. I think now that there's a 15-week ban, it's going to depend on, well, do people see 15 weeks as some sort of compromise? But so yeah, I do wonder if they're playing it too much. As I said, I mentioned this one voter in Wisconsin who I was talking to, and she was, she's not a Biden voter, but she's definitely an abortion rights voter. So that is something that I wonder about. But I will say, the Biden campaign has defined this as democracy and Dobbs, right? So it's trying to twin those issues, which is to say, it's not just about abortion rights. It's about people want to take away all your rights. And as we were talking about earlier in the conversation, democracy, they're trying to make the point that democracy does not work if the majority of residents in these states don't support, they want abortion rights, and yet the legislatures are blocking them because they are so gerrymandered. So I think that's why we're seeing these twin messages, because people do have a certain sense, and we've seen this in Ohio, for instance, that it's really not fair that to have this minority rule. When I say Ohio, I mean, before there was a ballot measure on abortion rights, there was this ballot measure that said you had to have 60% people to pass one of these ballot measures. Mm-hmm. And voters in Ohio said, no, that's not fair. It should be a simple majority.
Right. And so there's a sense among some Republican legislatures, in face of the reality that most residents of the state disagree with them, we're going to change the rules in terms of having access to that kind of direct democracy initiative. So, and to what extent will that make voters uneasy if they're paying attention to kind of the insider baseball kind of rules and mechanisms that are taking place? I think of the ad that the Biden campaign has run about restrictions to abortion. It's the question of, so this has happened, what will happen next in terms of rights? And I think about, attitudes about LGBTQ rights as being potentially on the chopping block. And so I think the Biden campaign is framing this as a larger issue on what a Trump administration or what Republicans could do in terms of those greater access to other rights that people have often taken for granted, including IVF. But it looks as though, Elisha, you mentioned the IVF ruling in Alabama, that Congress has shored up a bit on that front here as well. So I want to actually go to the last part of my presentation, and we'll just finish up with a conversation looking at the relationship between abortion, religion, and Christian nationalism. Oh, wait, we didn't talk about the access to the pill. Let's talk about that first. So I have this data up here. So in your reporting, are you finding that this is something that young people are talking? I imagine that women are cognizant of this fact, especially if you're living in a state where other means of access to abortion has been denied. So in your reporting, how much is this showing up as an issue that voters are caring about, or is it really just a small sort of selection of the population within those states? And so I'd love to hear from any of you who've maybe written about this topic.
Well, this is probably punting the question, but I, just because you mentioned that, I'm just thinking about young women in particular. I think so. To go back to the last question, I think the real question is going to be: are these young? We see this enormous in your study. It's so interesting in your poll, like the enormous disconnect between the gender gap that shows up, particularly among the 18 to 29-year-olds. Like that those women are really coming out to, or really saying they support abortion rights. Are they going to come out for Biden, or will they? Young voters have a tendency not to be high frequency voters, so we'll see if they come out. In terms of pills, I don't know. I kind of wonder if I was surprised that support for the people are less supportive of this, or that they're more inclined to support laws that oppose abortion pills. That was surprising to me, but maybe it's not. Maybe people aren't weighing into or aren't cluing into the Supreme Court discussion.
Yeah.
Grace. I was just going to say, with this graph, I find fascinating, and I think it really provides a political and messaging opportunity for Democrats. Frankly, the fact that, this falls differently than the previous chart on support for abortion legality in general, that here, when you ask specifically about the mailing of abortion pills, not only do over 2/3 of all Americans, support that continuing to be legal, but over half of Republicans and over half of all religious groups, including white evangelical Protestants and Latter-day Saints, which I found, quite surprising and really interesting. And I think it is, when specifically saying, oh, yes, there are proposals to, ban what you can send in the mail, that is really hearkening back, really giving 19th century Gilded Age, I don't even know what, prohibition vibes in a sense. Yeah. And I think a lot of people, even, people who identify as conservative or religiously conservative, don't like that. And however, that's not really permeated through as much in the political discussion. I think a lot of abortion rights advocacy groups really want the Biden campaign and everyone to be talking about things like the Comstock Act and the mail. So I think there is an opportunity there with the right messaging that we can see reflected.
Yeah. I think the anti-abortion side has really said for a number of years. I mean, they said coming out of when Roe was overturned and in the months previous to that, their big thing was going to be, we are going to fight pills. That's our next front. And so they talk about, when they talk about pills, they talk about chemical abortion. So it's sort of like the way they started talking about partial birth abortion. When they talk about chemical abortion rather than abortion pills, I think people do get a little queasy, like, oh, that shouldn't be sent through the mail. That sounds dangerous to me. So I think that may be what we're seeing, is that their messaging is working to a certain extent.
Yeah, I do think too, this might be a situation as a pollster and looking at how the question is worded. When you say that these pills are FDA approved, I'm wondering too that, it gets into kind of the health nature of this debate, which I think that kind of conversation about reproductive care as healthcare is taking a more prominent role in our policy debates here. But I do think that it's a good reminder that we're, of course, deep in the reporting and the analyzing of abortion attitudes and its role in American politics, but still there's a lot of Americans who aren't necessarily paying as much attention. And so if they're in a poll seeing, oh, well, something's FDA approved, why would it ban that sort of thing? I think you're seeing a little bit of an inflated sense of support there. And maybe too, Kate, that those libertarian tendencies of, do we really want to stop the mail, right? Not to mention the practical implications of trying to enforce that kind of ban. We'll have to see. But nonetheless, I think it's an interesting finding. But let's talk a little bit more about religion and abortion. And so 2 slides to share with you here is looking at the religious angle with respect to abortion attitudes. We are, after all, the Public Religion Research Institute, and so we always are looking at a religious lens for many of the policy attitudes that Americans hold. And here we show some of the major religious groups in American society and their attitudes about abortion. And one of the things that I think is often still surprising to many people who don't follow this topic on a day-to-day basis is the extent to which most people of faith are largely supportive of abortion rights. So with respect to abortion, there is no monolithic position when it comes to religion. We know, of course, that white evangelical Protestants tend to oppose abortion. And here we find only 27% of white evangelical Protestants say they support abortion legality. Along with Latter-day Saints, they're really only the 2 of the largest groups who oppose generally abortion legality. But really, most people of faith tend to be more broadly supportive. And of course, those who are religiously unaffiliated are probably the most supportive. And this actually corresponds, at least on the religiously unaffiliated part, with studies that show that once you control for everything else, Americans who have conservative theological views do tend to oppose abortion for, I think, many probably largely sincere reasons. But it's not the uniform position that we necessarily think when it comes to religion. The final graph I want to show you is looking at the relationship between Christian nationalism views in all 50 states and support for abortion legality. Here at PRRI, we have kept our eye very close on this growing spread of Christian nationalism as an influence within the Republican Party, especially within the MAGA movement. And so for those viewers not as familiar with Christian nationalism is really a political ideology that holds that the U.S. was founded and should remain an explicitly Christian nation. And so Christian nationalists are looking to enforce their theological views in terms of actual policy here. And one of the things we've been able to do in the last year is to graph among all 50 states the prevalence of this ideology. And here, this data is simply showing that the higher a state's residents score on PRRI's Christian nationalism scale, the less likely they are to support legal abortion. Again, I think demonstrating that conservative religious activists, I think, have had certainly a disproportionate influence in the policies that are taking shape in many of these states here. So I want to stop with the data and just kind of get any sort of last feedback from our panelists in terms of thoughts about how religion is shaping debates. Are you finding sort of some counter religious messaging happening in some states, interesting coalitions happening along the religious front with respect to abortion rights? And maybe start with I think we start with Grace this time, or just more generally, some thoughts about Christian nationalism and abortion, what you're finding.
Yeah, I had a really interesting experience in March going to cover the special election in Alabama's 10th House District, which always as an electioner, when you get to cover any state legislative election, especially a special one, very fun. And that was, a case in an area that we think of as pretty conservative in North Alabama outside of Huntsville. And the Democratic candidate, Marilyn Lance, who was running on abortion, she herself is a very devout practicing Episcopalian, and talked a lot about her faith on the campaign trail and to voters. And I think that, was a really interesting example of how especially Democrats running in red states can kind of, center their faith as, saying why I don't support the government being involved in this, or, saying I don't believe that people should be subjected to these life-threatening situations. I'm, very curious, specifically with that last chart about Black Protestants and Hispanic Catholics, and their views on abortion. They're going to be really important voting blocks in 2024 in some key swing states too.
Yeah, I'm also
Great.
curious about the Catholic numbers, just just in general, the number, because Catholics, even before Roe, like so in the late 60s, it was really the chief, or I think most potent anti-abortion support or anti-abortion sentiment really was in the Catholic community because of the belief of their faith that life begins at conception. So now when you see that the majority of Catholics do support abortion rights, you wonder sort of what the relationship with the church is. Like, are they still practicing Catholics, or is that just sort of where their kind of home was, and that's how they identify? But yeah, I mean, just the overall numbers I think are really interesting. And again, I think your polling has shown a drop, I believe, in the number of people who identify as evangelical since, I believe it's since 2012. Is that right? So I'm curious how that is shifting. What contribution that is making to the overall increase in support for abortion rights.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We have tracked for a long time here at PRRI why people are disaffiliating from religion. We haven't specifically asked about the abortion issue per se. We find that younger people, for example, are far more likely to disaffiliate from religion entirely if because of organized religion's treatment of LGBTQ individuals. So that's kind of a motivator for some. But there's certainly, I think, we also tend to find that LGBTQ Americans are far more supportive of abortion rights. Younger Americans are less religious and also more supportive of abortion rights. So I think there's definitely some sort of connection happening in there. But your point on Catholics, I think if we were to control in a model, for example, for church attendance, we'd find that the most devout, conservative Catholics who attend regularly probably you're going to stick to the party line when it comes to abortion. But clearly, among Catholics writ large, there's, I think, more of a desire to have accessibility to reproductive health care than not. And it's often shocking to people, but this isn't anything that's new. We've tended to find this pattern for the last decade or so. Elisha.
Yeah, I just thought this was probably the most fascinating part of all of PRRI's research. I think particularly that you could, break it down by race and what have you. I think that's something that's interesting in terms of like how religion and abortion are playing out like in the courts when it comes to these issues is I believe in Kentucky and Indiana, and I think there's one more state because there's a trend. You're seeing these coalitions of women plaintiffs who, may be anonymous, but Jewish Americans, Muslim Americans, I think in either the Kentucky or Indiana case, there's like a pagan plaintiff or what have you, who say, hey, this actually violates the religious freedom tenet in our state constitution. So we're going to sue, and it's infringing on our faith. So I think that's really interesting. And then opening up this kind of dialogue beyond what, traditionally, I think you definitely saw in the 1980s with the moral majority, and they're kind of taking over this abortion issue, along with, of course, anti-abortion Catholics. Because of that, it's kind of presented, at least by anti-abortion advocates in the space, as a Christian issue to be anti-abortion. And then this poll, suggests that that's not necessarily true with your breakdown of Protestants and Catholics and what have you. Yeah, it's also.
I think go ahead.
Yeah, and like you said, the only three groups are white evangelical Protestants, Latter-day Saints, and Jehovah's Witnesses, where a minority of folks disagree. I think I definitely want to look more into what Latter-day Saints and Jehovah's Witnesses, their dogma actually says about abortion, if anything. I think is super compelling.
Interesting. So we have a few minutes left. So I wanted to give you all an opportunity to maybe provide some other feedback. Anything else from the report that you found particularly surprising, something you want to unpack or even considering reporting on in the future?
Well, I guess you asked us earlier about like what things we'd be curious about to poll about, and I'm really interested in this whole question of exceptions and how, like we saw, for instance, in Ireland, to talk about religion, a super Catholic country. What really changed attitudes there were these stories about women who were denied abortions. They didn't fit under the exceptions and had these horrible health outcomes. And so, Ireland went the opposite way of the United States and approved this nationwide referendum to get rid of their abortion ban. So I'm curious, like the effect when people are changing their minds, like what is changing their minds? What news are they hearing? Are they hearing these stories? Is that what's changing their mind? Are they thinking about abortion differently? Because I think the biggest takeaway for me from the last 2 years is really that these old designations of pro-life and pro-choice don't really make sense anymore. I've just talked to so many voters who say like, well, I'm pro-life, but that's like there's a big pro-life but contingent out there.
Mm-hmm. Elisha, Grace, would you agree with that sentiment? That maybe the categories are outdated and maybe we need to reconceptualize or ask different questions about the issue?
Yeah, I don't know about outdated. I mean, one thing that like definitely jumped out is among those who said they believed abortion should be legal in most or all cases, there is a kind of a gap between most and all. In that 35%, it was just 9% who said they believe abortion should be illegal in all cases. So I'm really curious about that remainder who say most. To Kate's point, what does most mean? What could move them from a most to, going to the other side and believing abortion should be legal. And generally, I'm also just interested in the gender gaps, particularly among young voters between young men and young women, and some of the points about gender gaps in battleground states too, between Republican men and women too.
Yeah, I think on that front, I'm writing a lot about Gen Z. I have a book coming out about the influence of gender on Gen Z politics. And it is pretty remarkable the extent to which young women have become very staunchly pro-choice or very staunchly in favor of abortion being legal in all cases. We've seen a definite increase among young women. They're also less religious than young men. But one of the things that was really notable to me is we'd have a chart, and I encourage people watching to take a look at the report and look at all the data in more detail. But we broke down by party, groups of gender and age, and the group that was the most opposed to abortion legality were young men, 18 to 29, who were Republican, even more conservative than other Republican men. And I'm wondering, how these debates about women's role in society, masculinity within the parties, femininity, all of this is also linked to the battle over abortion politics. So that's something I'm going to be monitoring in the future. I mean, again, I would say, though, most young men tend to be broadly supportive, but there is certainly, I think, a burgeoning, very conservative reactionary movement within Republican men and Republican men. So Elisha, any thoughts for us here as we're getting ready to close? What do you think we should be asking in our polling here? I wanted to close by, you guys are reporting, you're talking to people regularly about this topic. We're posters, we're looking for new things to ask about. So what would you recommend that we consider asking about as we move forward, not just in this election year, but in the years ahead?
Yeah, I think to add on to earlier the questions from the panelists about, what does like this mean, like legal in all in most cases? I wonder what how the numbers would change if we asked folks, do you support abortion up to fetal viability? And then explain what that is, right? Because some people don't know. And then what about later in pregnancy? After viability, do you think someone should have, I guess, what could be considered an elective abortion just because they want to have an abortion later in pregnancy, which obviously sometimes that means that someone, if they're having an abortion later in pregnancy, if it's not for a medical emergency, maybe they struggle to get the money or what have you, or to travel outside of, say, if they live in a banned state. So I think that would be interesting. I think fetal viability, like, because we're on the beat, we understand what it is, but I don't think most Americans probably know what that means. Yeah, I think that'd be interesting. Also asking questions about IVF access, birth control, maybe breaking that down, like what types of birth control? Do you support the over-the-counter birth control pill that's out? Do you support IUDs? Do you know the difference between IUDs and like emergency contraception? Things like that I think would be really compelling.
We are going to be asking in our next survey about IVF in particular, because I think that kind of, to me, that's an issue that embodies this notion of does life begin at conception? These are large theological sorts of questions here that run into the policy realities. And so we are asking about IVF, but if you're someone who sincerely believes from a religious perspective that life begins at conception, you would be opposed to IVF, as is the Catholic Church, right? And so this is really an interesting dynamic that I think most Americans just aren't thinking about, right? The ramifications of having these kinds of bans put into place, or having, fetal personhood amendments that you're going to be seeing, I think, in some red states, the push to kind of to enact those. Grace, if you could write a question on our survey, what would it be? Let us know. Any thoughts there?
Ooh, I think, yeah, I'm, really curious. I don't know if this would be like an open-ended question, but what do people in their states want abortion access to look like? We know there's like a huge gap between, the percentage of most people who oppose total abortion bans, and yet these bans are still in place in so many states. This kind of gets at the democracy question too, but kind of breaking down, what does this mean? And I would think about this with IVF too, when Republican politicians have said in the wake of the Alabama decision, oh, we support IVF. Does that mean you're gonna pass laws to make more insurance companies cover it? Are you gonna, support more clinics opening up? What does that mean in practice? And I'm kind of curious from voters too, especially as more and more people are having personal experiences with this issue. I don't know the best way to design that in a survey question.
Open-ended makes us very nervous because, man,
I know. I shouldn't have said that.
Programs. No, that's where you find some really interesting things, right? So there are good reasons on occasion to do that, but I'll keep that in mind. Kate, I'm going to give you the last word in terms of questions, things we should be asking about.
Yeah, so I guess I would just pick up where Grace left off, which is to say, maybe not to a way of making it less open-ended would just be, are you hearing these stories? Like what, have you heard stories about women forced to cross state lines to get abortions or something like that? Have you heard stories about women who needed abortion later in pregnancy, to kind of understand like what people are hearing? Because just quickly to finally end, like, I think Elisha said this thing about viability. Viability is a really interesting question to me, right? Like, do you support abortion up until viability, which is what we're seeing in these ballot measures in Ohio and Kansas, et cetera, Michigan. But I think, when we've seen pollsters say, do you support viability? People are like, yes, absolutely. Abortion up to viability. Then you say, well, do you support abortion up to 24 weeks, which is viability right now? And they say, oh, no, absolutely not. So it's just like, how much are people getting? Any questions that can kind of get to people's changing understanding of what not only what abortion is, but really what pregnancy is.
Yeah, that's a good note to end on. I want to thank Grace, Elisha, Kate for joining me for this hour. It's been a really interesting and I think enlightening conversation. To those of you who have followed our work here, please go to our website. There's far more information about the study, lots and lots more graphs and information there. We also have data on Christian nationalism. I saw in some of the chat that some folks were asking how we define it, but we have a very clear set of measures that we use. And back in February, we released a 50-state report on Christian nationalism as well. So I'd encourage you all to take a look at that. Again, thank you so much for spending your time with us, and I wish all of you a great day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.